Thank you, everybody, for making it out, I guess, both in person and virtually this afternoon. So I guess you've already heard the title of my talk, so I guess let me jump into it and start discussing the work of Loïs Mailou Jones. Some of us might be familiar with Jones's work. These are some of her most famous paintings. And so we've got Ascent of Ethiopia, which is in the Milwaukee Museum of Art. Jones's Les Fétiches, which is in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And the Museum of Fine Arts Boston has a significant number of works by Jones. And perhaps some of us will recognize these. So right now, Ubi Girl from Tyre region is out on display. And perhaps over the years, some of us will have seen others. They're used also in some of the MFA's branded materials as well, so you might recognize the Negro student there. And I think as you can tell from this spattering of works from the Museum of Fine Arts at Boston's collection, Jones is an artist who is extremely versatile, has moved through many different stylistic idioms, and we'll see that there are certain common threads that we can trace throughout her entire career, certain sensibilities, but stylistically she's someone who is kind of constantly innovating throughout her very, very long life, and she lived from 1905 up through 1998. Some of us might also remember Jones from an exhibition that was held, I guess now a little over a decade ago at the MFA Boston. And then depending on our ages, maybe some of us will even remember the 1973 Reflective Moments at the Museum of the National Center of Afro-American Artists, which was a retrospective exhibition organized by Edmund Barry Gator, who I think maybe talked to you guys last week or is going to talk to you guys. So someone who knew Jones personally and was certainly a major champion of her work. Jones is an artist who we might associate with the so-called Harlem Renaissance. And in fact, I would just note that we're coming up on the 100th anniversary, right? So we're just into March, and we're now hitting the 100th anniversary of this watershed publication, survey graphic that was edited by the so-called midwife, or we might think about him as the architect of the Harlem Renaissance, a philosopher and cultural critic called Alain Locke. Locke, while he championed, as you can see, right, Harlem is the mecca of this new artistic movement, he was actually based in Washington, D.C., and this is also true of Loïs Jones, and we'll discuss some of their various movements, or maybe kind of psychogeography and actual movements through geography. And so while I think it's common to talk about a Harlem Renaissance, that name is maybe a little bit of a misnomer. We might think about a Washington Renaissance, a Chicago Renaissance, a Boston Renaissance, that this is not solely an artistic movement that is based in Harlem. And I guess for this reason, I'm interested, and this is relating back to my title, interested in setting Jones into a geographic constellation or maybe archipelago that's described by the sociologist and cultural theorist Paul Gilroy. And Gilroy thinks about a kind of hybrid forms of particularly Black culture. He's somebody who wants to, when he wrote this in 1994, was wanting to kind of shake up the way in which arts, literature, music tends to be studied by national schools. So I think probably if you look around the Museum of Fine Arts, you would see the history of the museum being organized by national categories. If you think about the way in which literature courses tend to be taught in schools, also often arranged around a kind of national tradition. And Gilroy wanted to trouble that idea and think about a whole series of exchanges, flows of culture that might move in multiple directions, and hence marshals this idea of the Black Atlantic. I think it's very appropriate for thinking about the career of Loïs Jones. So she begins in Boston, right, is always maintaining perhaps some sort of relationship to New York. Martha's Vineyard, as we'll see, is quite important for her, and her family owned property, and she summered in Martha's Vineyard from a very young age. France, and specifically Paris, is another important node in this constellation of Jones's career. She married a Haitian artist, and thus Haiti became increasingly important for her. Washington, D.C., where she was employed and worked at Howard University. And then I've written both Africa in quotations and Africa. And Jones actually didn't visit the continent until she was 65 years old. However, dating back to the late 1920s, if not arguably before, as we'll see, she's interested perhaps kind of in the image of Africa, thinking about ways in which African culture might be mined by modern African-American artists. And she's influenced likely by her colleague, again, Alain Locke, who worked at Howard University and was a proponent of modern black artists mining what he called the so-called ancestral art. So he's thinking about traditional African artworks. The other part of my title, right, was Mastery of the Black Atlantic, relates to the way in which Jones is positioning herself in a much longer genealogy, and then also is demonstrating great capacity in the visual arts herself. In 1939, she published this illustration in the Negro History Bulletin, and it shows, right, a modern artist who is surrounded by a group of kind of European, and we might think about that term mastery, right, could be related to demonstrating technical competence. We use that term old master, right, traditionally to describe, usually, right, it's male artists who have traditionally been celebrated by art history, and very often white male European artists. And Jones here is proposing a connection to that lineage, but also an expansion of it. And so we've got Cézanne, Velázquez, Picasso. She then includes some American artists, Sargent, Ryder, Copley, and also Mary Cassatt, Henry Ossawa Tanner, so an African-American artist, and then is thinking about a pantheon of contemporary black achievement in the visual arts with these other names, including her own, that she puts on either side. But certainly an artist who is interested in tradition. And the way in which she imagines, right, so this central figure who is apparently under the influence of the masters, looks a lot like Jones herself, right? So Jones, when she's depicted in her studio, depicted at work, right, almost always is wearing this artist's smock. And I would just note, and you can perhaps see it a little bit better in the details, that even in this fairly early moment of 1939, as well as Picasso and the slew of other names, she's thinking about the influence of Egyptian art and then more traditional forms, what looks like perhaps a South African cave painting, and so is alluding to a more global range of possible influences that an artist might undertake. And Jones, in this moment in the 1930s, is very invested in great degrees of technical competence. She produces drawings like these, and I think beyond just demonstrating her competence, she's also interested in rendering kind of luminaries who have achieved kind of important things, markers of perhaps almost a kind of like middle-class success within the African-American population. And here too, we might think that her style of creating images owes something to the influence of Alain Locke. And Locke had commissioned a German artist, Weinhold Reiss, to create a series of images of some of the major luminaries of the Harlem Renaissance. And I just realized I forgot to mention one thing when I was talking about this. So these types of illustrations appeared in Survey Graphic. And as I mentioned, right, Harlem being imagined by Locke as the center of this movement. Nonetheless, it's Roland Hayes, who's actually a Boston-based composer, who's on the cover of this publication as well, so kind of further, expanding that idea that the so-called New Negro movement was not solely based in Harlem. So we can see that Jones, I think, is taking cues from Rice and giving us this very spare yet naturalistic rendering of a dignified black figure. And this is somebody who's achieved a certain degree of social status and success. He's not just anybody, but instead we get, he's a Negro musician and a composer, so somebody who is a creative person, who's demonstrating and kind of creating their own masterworks potentially. Beyond just the context of Locke's world of the Harlem Renaissance, we might set Jones's work into kind of other more either longer traditions and more modern updates of those traditions. Pablo Picasso, slightly earlier, but in the same moment, very much interested in a return to the so-called old masters, and was looking to the work specifically of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, so one of the perhaps most important academic painters, portraitists of the 19th century. And Jones, too, seems to be emulating, perhaps channeling this idea of kind of negotiating a position in between tradition and modernity. So they're very, very naturalistic. They're drawings that require a high degree of technical competence. They render their figures in a dignified fashion, but also, they're extremely spare. They're boiled down to their kind of most essential components. And hence, they're perhaps expressing a kind of maybe like a small m modernism, as opposed to the more radical cubist experiments that Picasso would have undertaken slightly earlier. And I would just note that even in, so Jones locates Picasso, and I wonder if I can get a mouse up here. Maybe you can, I guess, oh, there we go. So Picasso here in her illustration, and then in her studio, she's got Picasso's head mounted on the wall alongside other possible sources of influence. And so certainly this idea that she would have been familiar with Picasso's articulation of Ingres, I think is certainly within the realm of possibility. The idea of mastery in the visual arts, I think, is also something that is particularly charged in this historical moment, and maybe is something, so a marker of Black achievement that maybe is less obvious for us today. So Carter Woodson, an important intellectual, pedagogical theorist in the miseducation of the Negro, talks about the importance of Black artists creating depictions of Black people as a kind of emancipatory move. And I'll just read part of this quote. In Europe, it should be noted, the Negro artist is not wanted as a mere imitator. Europeans will recognize him in the role of an enlightened artist portraying the life of his people. An English abolitionist said more than a century ago, quote, "The portrait of the Negro has seldom been drawn but by the pencil of his oppressor, and the Negro has sat for it in the distorted attitude of slavery." And of course, with this term mastery, there's another master in the room, the slave master. And just note that she puts in a portrait of Velázquez, who probably, she was aware, did own a number of slaves, at least one we know for sure, called Juan de Pareja. And Jones's friend Arturo Schomburg, who was an important art collector and bibliophile, had written about Velázquez and Juan de Pareja, the Black artist who Velázquez had owned and then eventually gave manumission papers. But she's perhaps thinking about this kind of triangulation of mastery as well, and the liberation that might happen from creating images like this one. Alain Locke, in a more pithy way, proposes, perhaps a similar idea about kind of directions for modern Black artists. So we can see, I mentioned Paul Gilroy. His Black Atlantic seems to kind of theoretically undergird the position that I want to take with Jones. But these are ideas that are circulating very much at the same time, this notion of the importance of mastery, and then drawing upon a kind of hybrid series of cultures in order to produce a blossoming form of Black modernism. It's also something that comes up within Opportunity, so a contemporary periodical dedicated to Black life. And in the December 1933 edition, we get these notable achievements, and they're listing the number of black people in supposedly prestigious kinds of employment. And I would just note, right, that the visual arts is one of those areas of achievement. And so the fact that Jones is wanting to imagine herself as one of those masters, is naming the names of those figures, it has important political ramifications. This is also a moment when the mainstream news is starting to pay attention to African American artists. And so particularly the Washington Post is covering a whole range of exhibitions, sometimes with slightly incredulous headlines, right? So Negro art exhibition has merit, right? The idea being that, oh, perhaps it wouldn't have merit for some reason. So there's a shifting position of black artists who are gaining recognition through the news media. Even though the headline is perhaps a little bit insulting, Ada Rainey, the reporter, actually has high opinions of the works of art that are on display. Jones, right, I think in some ways, right, sort of blazes the way, signals directions that John Wilson is also exploring. And so these kind of dignified renderings of figures of color, demonstrations of academic, traditional artistic skills, extreme excellence in the visual arts, is something that we might think of as having important political as well as aesthetic ramifications in this time period. So just to show you some other parallels between Wilson's work from the early 1940s and paintings by Jones in the 1930s. And as I was preparing for this talk, it occurred to me that Jones was maybe even doing a kind of more specific Boston reference when she is thinking about a revision of names or names that might be added to the canon of art history, to the canon of achievement. And I think she surely is thinking about the facade of the Boston Public Library and imagining, right, a expansion of the kinds of names when she's putting the names of modern black artists on what look like very similar pieces of architecture on the two flanks of her drawing. I should just, so certainly there are parallels in terms of subject matter and style in terms of the treatment of subjects by Wilson and Jones. Perhaps yet another way of demonstrating mastery is through their roles as art instructors. As you I'm surely already know, Wilson taught for many years at Boston University. Jones had a long career at Howard University. To their position as perhaps disseminators of knowledge, of technique, is something that's happening on a regular basis as a result of their classroom practice. Jones, as you can see here, is somebody who often painted outside or en plein air, right? So something that harks back to the Impressionists. I would just note, right, you can see she's doing it in her classes in 1967. It's perhaps a slightly more subversive or radical kind of act in the 1940s. So this is something that she was doing much earlier in her career. So here, Jones in the space of Washington, D.C. Here she is in Montmartre. We might think that this very public performance of a black artist, right, putting a black body, or in the case of her students as well, black bodies, achieving in the visual arts into public space is something that has political ramifications as well. Yet another parallel between Jones and Wilson is an interest in illustration. And so both of them made contributions to children's books. So here again, collaborating with her friend Carter Woodson. These are examples of a number that there's a special section that you guys have probably seen in the John Wilson exhibition that's also dedicated to illustration. So I want to now kind of move, after looking at some of the parallels between Wilson and Jones, I want to do a kind of survey of Jones's career and alight and undertake slightly closer readings of a number of works for the rest of the time of this presentation today. Jones was born in Boston and formed part of a not huge, so there were about 60,000 African Americans in Boston around the turn of the century, so far fewer black Bostonians than black New Yorkers, for instance. And Jones formed part of perhaps a kind of black elite community that was based in Boston, summered in Martha's Vineyard. And Jones faced perhaps slightly less discrimination in some ways than artists who were working in other parts of the country. And Barry Gaither proposes that perhaps because black artists were not viewed as such viable rivals to white artists, it was possible for a kind of one single exception, such as Jones, slightly earlier, Edwin Harleston, a portrait painter, had been able to study at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. And so Jones is able, I think she's the very first black woman artist to study at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. And nonetheless, she pursues a course of study in design, right, which might be viewed as a more kind of like feminine-coded type of creative enterprise. So these are some examples of her student work. You can see she has kind of great capacity for naturalistic renderings. She would have undertaken studies from sculpture, figure drawing, and you can see in this nude study, right, the figure is not completely nude because it was viewed still to be immoral for women to gaze upon the completely nude body of male models. Jones also starts working in designs for textiles in this moment, and she's extremely successful, and her designs are picked up and produced by textile manufacturers in New York and Paris, and she's often drawing upon influences from around the world. So she's picking up on indigenous American forms. We might think, and I'm sorry, this is slightly getting cut off on the edge here, but this design on the far right perhaps owes something to the kind of like Olmec face masks that you can see in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts. She was very interested in the Asian art collection at the Museum of Fine Arts, and indeed these are various studies that she did based on the holdings of the Museum of Fine Arts, and you can see again looking at a range of different sources. Ultimately, while she achieves success, it's perhaps something that she approaches with a little bit of ambivalence, because in textile designs, you often don't get your name attached to your design. And so Jones had sort of early successes. She would go into places and tell them that she had made the designs on the textiles that they were showcasing, and she was often met with a kind of mixture of surprise and perhaps not as much consideration as she would have hoped as a result of her race. And so while there's a kind of benefit to textile design that because it's anonymous, right, she didn't face the same kind of racial prejudices because it wasn't known who she was. Nonetheless, right, she didn't feel like she was getting the achievement she hoped for. And she's someone who certainly has a great degree of ambition for her future career. She'll absorb lessons, nonetheless, from design and then also perhaps an almost kind of curatorial sensibility. And I would just note that this interest in the kind of the arrangement of works of art, composing with either non-Western things or ancient things, and juxtaposing them against more modern forms of artistic expression, is very much part of a kind of period sensibility. And I'm showing you a wide range of different examples that have been captured photographically. So Alfred Stieglitz, the important impresario, promoter of American modern art, famously juxtaposes with Picasso and Braque's work, a Bacoda reliquary figure, a pre-Columbian Mesoamerican pottery, and then a wasp's nest. And I think Jones's sensibility of kind of combining different sorts of forms, looking for formal resonances that might exist between cultures, is something that is very much part of a kind of period modern sensibility. And so we might think about, right, modernism in some cases happening in terms of like new forms of representation, also happening in new forms of presentations, the way in which things are displayed in concert, either in a museum or a domestic space. And some of that sensibility makes its way into Jones's work. And this idea about kind of curating and combining different types of both bold graphics and various kinds of objects, kind of sampling photographically, as she'll do later in her career, is something that might connect her early works and her late works. And certainly we can observe right in her 1972 Ubi Girl from Thai region, we can observe the same kinds of kind of bold graphics, also true in her Buddha, where she's almost imagining the types of prints that she designed for textiles becoming a kind of wallpaper backdrop that offsets and works in concert with other kinds of objects. And I would just note that this kind of potential of Jones's work is something that has come to be only in kind of the last year. So the Brooklyn Museum has just reinstalled their American art collection, and they have used one of Jones's textile designs to create a kind of wallpaper installation. And so you can see works of art in concert with this kind of environment that was designed by Lois Jones. And she's certainly looking to a whole wide range of different cultures, and I would just note this idea about looking forwards and backwards simultaneously. So thinking about connections to tradition, connections to cultures outside of a Euro-American tradition is something we might also think of with John Wilson. So his eternal presence is difficult to think about without considering these kinds of Mesoamerican Olmec heads that are a kind of monumental precedent for the type of modern expression that he's undertaking. Both Jones and Wilson also undertook murals, and we'll see that their style of muralism is in some ways quite different. Muralism is a form, that it also, has connections back to the ancient world. We could think about ancient Egypt, where wall painting exists. We could think about the Italian Renaissance. And Jones created this mural for Cook Hall at Howard University. And it depicts, she's sort of mining a classical idiom. Certainly it looks like the buildings on the campus of Howard University that have these kind of temple front facades, but is thinking about the kind of ideals of learning that might be undertaken within the space of the university. Wilson's topic, as you probably are aware, for his mural, the incident is significantly more brutal. And we could think that both Wilson and Jones are perhaps picking up on more contemporary associations with murals and radical politics. And so Wilson, as a result of being active in Mexico, is looking to the Mexican muralists and thinking about the mural as a radical public form that might be used to speak about contemporary politics. If we think about various initiatives of the New Deal, and Jones's mural came about as a result of New Deal funding that helped to contribute to the creation of Cook Hall at Howard. It also relates to a kind of socialist set of values. Mob violence and lynching and so the murder of African Americans is also something that Jones treated in her work around the same time. Perhaps not as explicitly as Wilson, but nonetheless, we get her depiction of mob victim mediation, where she was able to encounter a subject so that the sitter, or the model who posed for her, is someone who had actually witnessed his own brother being murdered by a lynch mob. And so this kind of connection to the horror of racist violence in the United States is something that she was trying to sort of explicitly channel with this work. So certainly the idea about racist violence is a kind of present danger for both Jones and Wilson, and they're wanting to decry it with their artworks. Both Jones and Wilson have important experiences abroad, and we'll see that landscape in particular for Jones is something that relates also to perhaps a kind of subtle politics related to race. So in 1937, Jones traveled to Paris. She had a sabbatical year from Howard and was able to set up a studio there and really takes advantage of the art scene in Paris. She spends lots and lots of time, as we saw, kind of painting in public space, and her work in some ways sort of transforms. She becomes fascinated by the French landscape and cityscape. She reflected upon her time in Paris in 1996 at a fairly advanced age, and I just want to get out of our PowerPoint and have us watch just a little bit of a section of Jones, in her own words, talking about her time in Paris on Good Morning America.
It is now 10 minutes before the hour, and up next, with apologies to James Joyce, we have the portrait of an artist as an elderly woman, a very special woman with a unique place in American history and American art. Joel Siegel has her story this morning as we mark the first day of Black History Month.
It was interesting that my parents realized that I was talented, and they gave me paints and paper and encouraged me, so that it began very early with me.
Early for artist Loïs Mailou Jones and early for our century. Ms. Jones is 90 years old, and this is her year. This show, featuring her work and the work of her students at Howard University, where she taught for 47 years, opened on her 90th birthday. This show, featuring her work in Paris in the 40s, just opened at the Studio Museum of Harlem. In 90 years, she's been there, done that, painted the T-shirt.
They told me, Lois, you know, you're talented, but you're not going to make it in this country. You're going to have to go abroad, because the establishment here in this country was not interested in the work of black artists.
She was one of dozens of great black artists, writers, and musicians, expatriates like James Baldwin, Dizzy Gillespie, Josephine Baker, who lived in Paris.
That sense of freedom and people not isolating you because of your color. It was your talent that counted. And so it was with the musicians, the artists, the writers. I mean, so many of them who went. I remember, well, I was rather young and maybe I dare say attractive in those days. And I went to a French restaurant, and the garçon kept looking at me. And finally he came over and said, pardon, mademoiselle, vous êtes Josephine Baker? I said, no, I'm not Josephine Baker, but je la connais. I know her.
When she came home, her art...
So she just, enjoyed Paris and finds it certainly not a completely a society that's free of racial issues, but certainly somewhere that doesn't have the same kind of overwhelming racial climate compared to the United States. So she does many, many paintings in Paris. Here, just juxtaposing Wilson's time in France, where he discovers this sort of similar kind of freedom. And I think one key difference, while both artists blossom in France, and Jones would go back subsequent summers, as is evinced by that image of her painting with those little boys who seem to be smoking cigarettes, that she continues to return to France in many of her time off from teaching. Unlike Wilson, who adopts or has a major influence from Leger, who he studies with in Paris, Jones, again, is much more kind of moving through a range of different styles. Certainly she made many connections. So she befriended the painter Émile Bernard, so an artist who is perhaps best known for work in the 19th century. But had a massive studio that he allowed Jones to use. He allowed her to store some of her work in his studio, and was a kind of constant supporter of Jones's work. And to such an extent, and again, thinking about these kind of genealogies, he's wanting to have a relationship with old masters. Jones published in its entirety a letter from Émile Bernard in a book that she published of her paintings in the early 1950s. She creates images like these ones, and a whole range of different views, different places in Paris, in Paris and beyond, throughout the years. And I think some of the ideas that she comes up with and expressed, that Paris was a kind of different sort of, or France was a different racial climate to much of the United States, is something that she's maybe indexing, So her own travels through space, and through places that she finds less oppressive than much of the United States, is something that she's reflecting in her works. And in many of these paintings, and this is also true of paintings that she does in Haiti, she puts the location next to her signature. So there seems to be a really vested interest in kind of plotting her own movements, again, through this quote-unquote Black Atlantic. So here we've got Haiti next to Loïs Mailou Jones, in this case Montmartre, and so it's sort of doing a geographic location with her work. And I would just note, right, so here Wilson, creating a kind of similar view of a smaller French town. We could extend this idea of kind of like landscapes of liberation, places in the Black Atlantic that are not governed by the same kind of oppressive norms of race as much of the United States, to Martha's Vineyard. And Jones's family had owned property on the vineyard for various generations. So her maternal grandmother, Phoebe Mosley Adams Ballow, who had worked in service for a white family, saved up enough money to purchase property in Oak Bluffs and Edgerton. So from a young age, Jones was spending her summers brushing shoulders with an African-American elite. And so she got to know the composer Harry Burleigh. She met the sculptor Meadowarick Fuller. And then her family kind of summered right next to the family of Dorothea West, who was an important writer as well. So we might think that this too is a vision of a landscape or a seascape that is not governed by quite the same kinds of racial norms as the rest of the United States. Right, so she was going, creating images of the vineyard from very, very early on in her career. And in fact, her very first exhibition, her mother sold beauty products, and one of her mother's clients organized an exhibition of Jones's work on the vineyard in 1923. So the first place that she showed her work was the vineyard. And it was somewhere that she continued to go right throughout her life. Right here she is with the Clintons, selecting a work that they were going to take to the White House. Certainly we should remember this kind of longer history of an African-American presence on Martha's Vineyard. And we could think that Jones is indexing this location within the Black Atlantic by deciding to paint Gay Head, Massachusetts. It's also a mode of working that might link us to a more kind of contemporary tradition. It's coming in this moment of regionalism, a time when many American artists are thinking about painting areas outside of kind of New York or major metropolitan hubs. So Grant Woods, who paints the Midwest and Iowa in particular. Marsden Hartley, who some of us may be familiar with, who declared himself the painter of Maine. And we could think that Lois Jones is similarly thinking about a kind of American regionalism concentrated on Martha's Vineyard. I think also this interest, or perhaps sort of recognition of extended property ownership, kind of investment in a community, survival of people of color, is something that connects Jones to more contemporary artists. And so her connection to Martha's Vineyard, the family ownership of property, is something that made me think of a much more contemporary initiative by a younger artist called Kevin Beasley. And Beasley, as a part of the Prospect Biennial in New Orleans, purchased property in the 9th Ward that he is continuing to hold on to. He organizes social activities there. He's invested in the neighborhood. He's a stakeholder in the neighborhood. And many of his works from this time period are based on depictions of the property that he has purchased. So I think we can see in Jones resonances with more contemporary concerns. It was also in Paris that Jones starts thinking perhaps more seriously about Africa and African art. A painting that she created in 1938 is what she would list when she's kind of reflecting back on an African influence on her work as one of the very first. And she encountered a series of masks in a Parisian gallery. So these would have very likely been kind of like decontextualized and recontextualized right in a sort of white cube space. And she says that she stumbled on them by chance. And this idea of finding something kind of marvelous, and the way in which she, and perhaps even slightly sublime, the way in which she renders these masks, where they sort of feel like they're overlapping one another. They seem to almost have appear in the way that they might emerge out of the kind of the murkiness of the subconscious in a dream. And so we might think about Jones as undertaking her own version of a kind of Afro-surrealism in this early moment. And certainly, right, the 1930s is this moment where many, particularly French surrealists, are interested in mining non-Western cultures. And so we could think about Jones as perhaps working in this surrealist field where she's kind of tapping into unconsciousness in order to produce new forms. We could think also that she's very much in lockstep with other kind of adopters and adapters of the legacy of Pablo Picasso. Certainly we know that she was interested in Picasso, and I would just note, right, her composition that serves as that kind of like all-over filling up of the space with these with kinds of masked faces and visages, right, is maybe not a world away from the things that Jackson Pollock, the very famous abstract expressionist, is doing that same year in 1938. Just note, so while Jones lists 1937, her time in Paris, as maybe kind of being the beginning of the influence of African forms, right, she's already looking to it even earlier. So in 1928, she created this image for the cover of Opportunity, which she subsequently reworks as a painting in 1935. She's also thinking about Egyptian culture and ancient Egypt as being a part of Africa and being an example of a kind of great black civilization. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, but it is just closed, but Achille Tomasino, who for a number of years worked here at the MFA Boston, he's now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, just organized, it's now closed, a really wonderful exhibition called Flight into Egypt that was looking at the impact of Egyptian art on African American art and African diaspora art that included this work by Jones. Jones is, I think, certainly, as we can see from this illustration that I began the talk with, is thinking about Egypt as a possible source to mine as part of a kind of usable past that might be tapped into by a modern African-American artist. So she's connecting to Egypt, but also, right, with her title, right, talking about Ethiopia as well. And she's very much part of a kind of broader field of black cultural creators. So Meta Warwick Fuller, the sculptor who Jones knew, also Boston-based. Aaron Douglas, who is perhaps one of the most well-known artists of the Harlem Renaissance, are both people who routinely mine Egyptian culture in order to produce modern American art. Jones, I think, right, is connecting, perhaps betraying some of the influence of this broader field of American artists, but is surely also reacting to a kind of extended Egypt mania that is sweeping through Europe and the United States. And I think her design for the figure in the foreground right, seems as though it owes some debts to the contents of the tomb of Tutankhamun. Right, this was the tomb was discovered in 1922. The innermost contents are opened up in February of 1923, and it's much reported on. Right, so you can see it's front page news in the New York Times that this discovery has been made. And it seems as though she's taking a kind of composite series of elements from the funerary objects of King Tut and reworking them in order to produce this head in the foreground. It's also a kind of perhaps sort of a feminine-looking head, right? Maybe it's sort of gender ambiguous, but because of the way in which it has earrings, seems to have lipstick, there's perhaps a suggestion she's thinking about a kind of a female pharaoh as well. The influence of this discovery, right, makes its way into many different places. So this Egyptomania is sort of wide-sweeping, but you can see here right, the same funerary mask of Tutankhamun making its way into this poster that is promoting art and music in Chicago. And we could think that Jones, right, like many others, is thinking about ancient Egypt as a kind of precedent for the achievements of modern African Americans, and is proposing that right, this was a great black civilization of the past, and it's one that might be renewed in the cultural achievements that are happening in the United States. Right, and specifically, she's thinking about those happening. She gets this mu for music, dra for drama, and then art at the very top of this skyscraper. Certainly, the skyscraper, right, is one of the leitmotifs of modernity. And people talk about the cathedrals of industry. Skyscrapers are thought about these kind of American monuments. And right, America doesn't have ancient ruins, but what we do have are these kind of new modern monuments. And Jones, I think very cleverly, uses a kind of inverted obelisk form, right, to render her skyscraper, so making this kind of further connection between Egyptian civilization and modern African-American civilization. The fact that her painting is absolutely chock full of blue, I think is also no accident. And as part of this kind of broader Egypt mania, there's a fascination with this Egyptian blue. And George Washington Carver, who probably many of us know for his contributions to kind of botany and science and agriculture, was also somebody who was an artist. So there he is with one of his own paintings, very, very interested in the creation of particularly blue pigments. And here is his Egyptian blue, ninth oxidation, that he also created in the 1930s. And so Jones's use of the color blue right, connects, I think, also to this broader Egypt mania. I hadn't known about Carver's experiments with pigment until I read a book that I would recommend to all of you guys, written by the Harvard professor Imani Perry, and the name of the book is Black and Blues. Perry thinks about a whole wide range of different associations with the color blue. Continuing from there, right, as we can see, right, it seems to be a kind of jazz that Jones is imagining being performed in her modern city. And we can think about any number, right, of associations with jazz, the blues, in particular, right, from right around the same time as Jones is painting, we get the jazz anthem by Fats Walter and Harry Brook and Andy Razoff, What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue? And so this idea about blueness, right, perhaps the position of people of color in the United States and in the world more broadly, right, is something that also is connecting, right, these more traditional kinds of forms to more modern iterations of culture. I would note also that in the background, she's got these kind of concentric circles that seem to be emanating out from the modern city. And certainly this could relate to the idea of kind of like culture spreading outwards. I mentioned the idea of the Black Atlantic, the idea of kind of flows of culture going in multiple directions certainly seems to be something that Jones is interested in. But for audiences at the time, these concentric circles might have had kind of more specific resonances. And in particular, in relationship to like radio broadcasting and the creation of new sorts of media in the form of film. So I'm showing you two variations of the RKO Radio Pictures logo that also have these same kinds of concentric circles. And so there seems to be an allusion or resonances with very, very modern media, even as she's channeling more traditional kinds of ancient Egyptian forms. And proposing a connection between kind of these modern monuments and more traditional monuments that we see in those pyramids on the left-hand side. Egypt and Ethiopia perhaps also can be set into a broader constellation of Black culture and radical politics. And as maybe some of us know, Ethiopia, particularly under Emperor Menelik II, right, is able to keep off Italian attempts at colonialism. So Ethiopia, right, perhaps a particularly charged place in Africa, and maintains independence. And I think it's interesting that in the sun, that Jones gives us. So it's a black star. And I think, again, for period audiences, it would have been difficult not to think about the ideas of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, this transnational black political entity that also ran this very modern steamship line, the Black Star Line. And so Jones perhaps is incorporating a kind of subtle reference to Garveyite politics with this black star that seems to be bathing figures who link Africa to modern America. She'll return to ancient Egypt in the 1950s. So here thinking about kind of Egyptian heritage, so again mining an Egyptian past, thinking about connections between here it seems to be herself and ancient Egypt. And again, and this owes a debt to Flight into Egypt, we might think about Jones as kind of signaling directions that more contemporary artists will go in. So these are photographic works by Lorraine O'Grady, so a kind of conceptual and performance artist who's thinking about connections between her own family and then figures that she finds in Egypt. Jones would also think about national liberation, and this is a mural that she created for what is now a nonprofit organization called the Sasha Bruce House, but it was a kind of diplomatic house called Africa House. And she does a rendering of Africa that almost is a kind of like infographic. Right, so she seems to be looking to the mass media once again, here thinking about the kinds of images that might appear in like glossy magazines. And I would just note that with these kind of vectors, right, she includes, right, territories seeking greater freedom, right, so it's very much thinking about national independence movements, the throwing off of colonial shackles, and specifically, right, is celebrating a man who was very, very iconic in the 1950s, right, the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. And you can see that Jones's rendering of Nkrumah perhaps owes something to the types of images that circulated within the mass media as well. In our remaining time, I want to think a little bit about the ways in which Jones's career takes more kind of postmodern directions beginning in the 1960s. And she continues to mine various forms of heritage and also, so I've got roots and roots, or routes, depending on your pronunciation, but thinking about right, kind of trajectories in space and a connection to various kinds of usable pasts. She becomes, as a result of her marriage to a Haitian, Pierre Noël, Jones will increasingly start to bring Haitian culture into her work. So here she's alluding to the veves, these symbolic drawings or patterns that represent spirits. In 1968, and this was a work that was shown in Barry Gaither's Afro-American Artists, New York and Boston. Jones had multiple works in that exhibition, one kind of more traditional painting, this one much more kind of radical collage, where she's thinking about contemporary American politics in 1968, which of course was a particularly fraught year around the world, also the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And here we might think that Jones is connecting to a kind of return of the avant-garde that we can see as part of a kind of broader postmodern trend within the art world. And so her rendering of contemporary American society with connections to figures in Africa, to figures in other parts of the world, to historical leaders. It's just this kind of rendering of a kind of Black America might owe something to the kinds of, sort of remixes of what was also a fairly tumultuous society, the Weimar Republic in Germany, by Hannah Hawk, so an important Dadaists. And Robert Rauschenberg, who's often seen as one of the kind of key figures for postmodern art in the United States, is somebody who similarly is doing this kind of remix of the mass media, collaging different forms together. And so we might think about Jones as very much operating kind of in lockstep with more contemporary or postmodern trends in art. And this idea of collage and mining photographic sources is something that's going to inform her subsequent paintings for much of the rest of her career. I mentioned before that she had kind of worked with the image of Africa rather than having actually visited Africa. And it's only at 65 years old does she visit the continent for the first time. She undertakes a really important trip, visits 11 different countries, and generates a whole series of photographic images that she uses for slide lectures. And I think this is something that does bear mentioning. That these days, right, if you were going to make a lecture, right, when I put this lecture together, what did I have to do? Like go and scan materials, look on the internet to see where I could find images. But in the good old days of art history, you had to take photographs of things. And so Jones created a huge photographic data bank of images of traditional African artworks that were then brought back to Howard University and make up a significant bulk of their African art slides. And so as part of this journey, right, with her study of contemporary art in Africa, right, she necessarily takes loads and loads and loads of photographs. And that kind of photographic way of seeing is also going to migrate into her work. I mentioned already right, that she starts out with this kind of design sensibility. And I think we'll see in her works from the 1970s and early 80s, she's returning to certain elements of her early career. So she has this kind of bold graphic illustrations that she uses for publications in the 1930s and 40s. And she'll return to this kind of graphic sensibility for works that are based on her experiences in Africa, such as Dahomey here from 1971. These are also works right from the same period, many of which are paying homage to geographic locations in Africa, so Kinshasa in the Congo, Oshogbo, an important location in Nigeria, and she is thinking about a kind of return to this kind of bold graphic sensibility that characterized many of her textiles. And here, rather than mining a more global culture, is thinking about mining a kind of Pan-African, Black Atlantic in order to produce these works. It's a little bit hard to tell from the slide representations, but her moon mask, actually the mask element is actually a kind of three-dimensional element, and quite often she was collaging in different kinds of materials. And so again, thinking about this sort of postmodern sensibility, moving away from painting as solely brushstrokes on flat surface, Jones is starting to incorporate a kind of mixing of media. Just note that also in this period, she creates one of her very few completely abstract compositions, which is also something that she'll only sort of briefly dabble in. So her Suriname of 1982 might make us think about Wilson's kind of experimentation with a sort of pure abstraction in the middle of the 20th century. Jones also will revive Josephine Baker, who, as she told us in that interview, was somebody that she actually was familiar with. And so here she's thinking about Baker, celebrating her dynamic dance style, thinking about her as a kind of Pan-African figure, linking her to works of traditional African art, get these bold kind of textile forms. And I would just note also, so Baker, who died in the early 1970s, is somebody in the 70s who perhaps would have also been associated with the civil rights movement. And so her connections to kind of progressive politics, politics of race, she certainly epitomizes a certain kind of Black beauty and modern beauty. And Jones, I think, is surely wanting to evoke all of those kinds of ideas. She's also thinking in more historical kinds of terms, and so her kind of art historical impulse it seems to have made its way into this painting as well. Because as you can see, right, she's channeling historical representations of Josephine Baker, things from the 1920s. So particularly right, the figure on the left by Paul Colon, right, with this kind of dynamic shadow on the body of a figure in motion, it seems to be something right, that Jones is kind of connecting to, sampling, and then remixing in this postmodern composition. I would note also that there's actual fabric that is kind of making up the feathers that seem to be part of the back of the costumes on the two figures on either side. So once again, doing this kind of mixing of media that I think is best described as postmodern. So I think there's a kind of sort of, again, what I suggested before, sort of full circle in Jones's career, that she's going from her kind of earlier curatorial design sensibility that she explores in the 1920s, and is in some ways kind of returning to it for works like Ubi Girl from Thai region. And this painting, I think, and maybe can be corrected if I'm wrong, but I believe is the only painting by Jones that's currently on view in the MFA. I think, again, suggesting this idea of a black Atlantic. It's not on view in the American wing of the museum, but instead is being shown alongside works of African art in the museum's African art collection. So this idea, right, that an American artist could also in some ways be African, right, seems to be posited by the way in which the museum is curating this work. It combines, a girl that Jones had observed who has kaolin pigment on her face, someone who spoke the Ubi dialect, was from the Thai region of the Côte d'Ivoire. And Jones described her with the following. She says, "There was something about the deep look in her eyes that impressed me as being symbolic of Africa." So she's thinking about this woman almost as a kind of metonym for the entire continent, and as a result brings in a range of different references. So the mask that is in profile, something that's made by the Dan people, these doubled kind of mask-like forms seem to be based on Pende masks from the Congo. And then this knot in the lower left-hand corner is an Edo pattern from the people of Benin that's referred to as like the rope of the world, this idea about kind of intertwined connections of cultures, which is, of course, very much in keeping with Jones's broader mindset and ideas about kind of Pan-African connections. I know we're almost out of time, but to show you some other examples of her work from this period, so in the early 1980s, you can see a similar sort of like photographic remix where she's taking the same figure and thinking about setting this girl against kind of stylized motifs, patternistic backgrounds. So she's very much kind of designing a black Atlantic and drawing upon images that she surely shot photographically initially. Jones's work from the 1970s and 80s, I think in many ways anticipates directions also, right? So I said she's kind of looking backwards, thinking about kind of traditional forms, but at the same time always connecting to modern art, or modern contemporary art, and reinventing herself throughout her career. And I think in many ways she's anticipating directions, so what are known as like neo-geo, right? So these types of this kind of circuit forms of Peter Halley, the repeated, quoted, branded forms of Ashley Bickerton, right, these newer types of compositions that are getting created, right, seem to be things that have a very, very similar kind of graphic, bold sensibility to the kinds of remixes that Jones is undertaking in the same period. And so I think an important figure for the way in which she continues to have her pulse, to have her fingers on the pulse of the art world. One of the very last works that she created is this absolute heritage. And you can see, right, perhaps that she's commissioned by Absolute Vodka to create something that perhaps is right, even closer to the work of Bickerton, right, explicitly engaging with brands and mixing those together with traditional African art forms. And I think one slight difference, and this points to kind of the right, so Jones, right, gets tapped for this very prestigious commission. It was something that really major artists also got at the same time. And I'm showing you, right, Keith Haring, but Andy Warhol, for instance, many important artists of the 1980s and 90s. And when Jones was tapped to do it, it was not Absolute Jones, right? So she still is getting, recognized for her importance as a major figure in American art, but nonetheless, right, perhaps because of her race, is getting slightly camouflaged, right, beneath the name of Heritage when the Absolute Vodka Company runs this ad. So I think I will stop there, but we've seen the kind of various ways that Jones's early formation at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, her design sensibility, her interest in kind of presentation as well as representation, her constant innovation and kind of forward and backward looking elements have made her a really, really compelling artist. And certainly from my opinion, Jones is a master of American art. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions from anyone who has them.
It's on either side of the auditorium if you just give us a second to get to you.
Hi, can you hear me? This is not a question. Thank you. That was a wonderful lecture. Learned so much. But just to say, the Ubi girl from Thai region, you're correct, is the only Jones work on view.
Okay, thank you for confirming that.
And it's in the Carter Gallery, 171. So if you walk through the Lindy Gallery, the large gallery there with African art, it's located there. So just if anybody wants to see it.
And I would just plug, also, like Deep Water, I think also is exploring similar themes of kind of flows of cultural connections. And they're a little bit hard to find, but if you go around the back, you will see that there are also album covers of jazz albums in that exhibition too, and jazz music being piped into one of the galleries. So I think Jones very much hails, certainly her painting treating Ethiopia, Egypt, and jazz very much fits into that context.
Thank you. This is lovely. I wanted to ask, because we have the John Wilson exhibit now, and I wanted to ask whether there's communication between Wilson and Loïs Mailou Jones. Because when we walked in, right at the front, you don't see these artists that surround Wilson. You're just seeing him. And this wonderful panoply of other African-American artists were out there at the same time. So is there documentation? Did they write letters? Did they have parties? Do you know what the interaction was?
I think they have, the fact that she's somebody, so she's quite a lot, so I think Wilson is born in 22 and Jones is born in 1905. And so I think there's limited interaction between them, but they've both had very similar training. And Jones is sort of the trailblazer in some ways, although we could argue that Edwin Harleston comes first. Crite also, another important figure, who's active in Boston. I think that there are maybe more like parallel concerns. As far as I know, Jones was not corresponding with Wilson, but they are both artists who maybe express a kind of like, they're not maybe kind of like small c conservatism in their style of working. They're very invested in academic skill, technical brilliance. They're kind of absolute masters when it comes to naturalistic renderings. And so I think there's a kind of similar aesthetics in politics that maybe they're not shouting quite so explicitly, but are undertaking via the way in which they create their works. I think Wilson is maybe more of a radical because of his years in Mexico. So there's a much more kind of explicit kind of Marxian strand of politics that makes its way into his work. And Jones is somebody who I think is drawing from lots and lots of different sources. This is an idea that the scholar Rebecca Van Diver comes up with, but she thinks about Jones as being a figure who is kind of like rooted in the middle of things, that she's not a kind of like fringe radical. She comes from kind of the middle classes or the upper middle classes, and her way of creating modern art, although as I've argued, right, sometimes relates to, as part of a kind of cutting edge, is not something that is kind of courting controversy for the most part. And so I think there's maybe a sort of like, perhaps sort of similar trajectories. I think Wilson is maybe a little bit more radical in his embrace of different figures. But my understanding is that they're not people who are corresponding directly, but they're drawing upon a common body of ideas, and some of those are kind of making their ways or being processed and making their way into their art.
Hi. So my name is Erica Wilson. I'm the daughter of John Wilson, and I can say that he was very grounded in the Boston Black art scene. I do not have a big history in art, so forgive me. I grew up around Dana Chandler and Alan Crite, and Elma Lewis. I mean, those were all people that my dad was in communication with in the Boston art scene writ large. There was one other thing I was going to say, but I've forgotten what it was. It may come back to me, but he was very grounded here in Roxbury and in Boston.
Yes, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
I was struck looking at the images of Jones and Art Deco. I mean, she's very much a design-oriented person, and it comes through so strongly. They're very different, I think, Jones and Wilson, in their aesthetics.
Yeah, I think they have moments of confluence. And
Both wonderful, but really they're in their own sphere.
Yeah, and I certainly didn't mean to suggest that they're like, I would agree with you that they're each kind of articulating their own thing. I think there are just moments where there are parallels that we can trace. And I guess partially when I was invited to give this talk, I was thinking, okay, I should try to think about as many connections to Wilson as I can, because Jones is another artist who has kind of formation in Boston, even though her career is largely happening kind of through the context of DC, and she's very much part of the Howard University scene, has connections to other colleagues there. And I think you're right, they're definitely both individuals who have their own style of working. But I think there are certain moments, and perhaps the politics of a dignified aesthetic or the politics of great achievement within the visual arts are things that might unite both of them.
Well, I would like to say this, that my understanding about Loïs Mailou Jones is that she basically, in her childhood, spent a lot of time at this museum. And she saw a lot, and maybe in certain ways, this is why her art took such a wonderful, various degrees of artistry. But she, we must remember, was shunned by this very museum because she wanted to teach here, and the museum said, I think you should go down south with your people and teach them. And I think it's very important that that should come out, that she was not bitter. And then the other point is, when she went to Paris, she befriended Celine. And my understanding is that her selling of her art did not take off if it wasn't for her very close friend, Celine. And I saw in some of her pictures in her home studio, she had a picture of Celine. And I often wonder about the Josephine Baker painting. What is the significance of the two-toned individual in the middle? And I myself have often thought that that was a tribute to her friend Celine, who was white, so that they had the contrast of the deep friendship between the black and white. And it was really a large responsibility, or it was a large part of Celine's dedication to her, which kicked off her real, I think, selling of her art and perhaps her becoming quite famous.
Yeah, I think that's an important, so thank you for bringing that up. And I don't know how much Jones, and I don't know maybe enough about the history of the museum school versus the Museum of Fine Arts, because she's, as far as I understand, she was told by the museum school, which, I mean, I think it's not right to think about museums as like monolithic institutions, but you're exactly right. She's told by the museum school that they don't have a place for her, which is what sends her going to Sedalia, North Carolina, to the Palmer Memorial Institute, and then she gets recruited by James Herring. I think she also, I mean, even that heritage image, she also is someone who's interested in thinking about kind of mixed heritage as well, so like both black and white, in terms of the artists that she's citing here. It's something also that that James Porter emphasizes in the essay that accompanies the Loïs Jones paintings retrospective catalog that she created herself. And so this idea of a duality as being both, I mean, it's a kind of double consciousness perhaps, right, of both connecting to a black tradition as well as a white Euro-American tradition, I think is definitely how she saw herself as also. And I should just say, related to Céline Tabarly, who took that painting, or took that picture of Jones' painting, I should note that the image of the Indian shops here, this is a work that she entered into an exhibition at the Corcoran, which is a no longer extant museum that was in Washington, D.C. So this is now migrated into the collection of the National Gallery of Art. But Jones felt that it was the judges in the competition were sufficiently racist that if she had dropped it off herself, they would have just tossed it right into the discards pile. And so she got Céline Tabarly, and this I think is a practice she used repeatedly, to drop off her work so that people thought it was made by a white artist so that it would get the same kind of consideration as those of her white peers. So this ends up winning a prize in the Corcoran exhibition, but probably would not have if it had been Jones who dropped it off. Yep.
Hold on one second.
That would have, oh, sorry. I thought your talk was really fabulous. I enjoyed it so much, and I'm new to this whole group of people, the Boston artists who were women and the Black American Boston artists. So it's been an eye-opener for me. I did think that maybe you neglected talking about her gender a little bit in terms of a handicap and getting the recognition that she so clearly deserved. And I wonder whether that was accidental or purposeful.
I would agree that that's an issue. It's something I've written a bit more about in my scholarship on Jones. I think, so the essay that's in the, on Washington, the collection of books, so the book on Washington modernism deals with that a bit more. And I think perhaps makes her, right, her achievements even more noteworthy, that she's facing this kind of double set of prejudices, that she's both a woman and a woman of color. It does result in her, she's less, there's a lot of headbutting that happens there's big egos at Howard. So like James Porter, James Herring, and Elaine Locke all don't get along very well with one another. And I think because Jones is a woman, she's not seen as a rival in quite the same way and is able to kind of pick and choose, and so is able to maintain good relations with both Locke and Porter, who at times don't see eye to eye. Herring and Locke apparently hated one another, and so she kind of tactically takes advantage of it. Although for that reason, like Jones is never voted to be the chairman or the chairperson. There are always chairmen at Howard of the art department, despite, as we heard, teaching there for 47 years. She gets hired later, right? It's only through her inviting James Herring to the Palmer Memorial Institute, who he then sees what she's doing with this, the young women in the school there, and then is like, oh yeah, actually you should come to Howard. But he had hired James Porter first. So I think a point well taken. I guess in the interest of trying to condense, I don't know, thinking about what topics I was going to talk about in what feels like a challenge for me of condensing her entire career into one presentation. I perhaps neglected that, so thank you for bringing it up, and I'm glad we got to talk about it now.
We have time for one last question.
Could you say a little bit more about her Haitian husband?
Yes. So he was a graphic designer, and they had initially met in the 1930s. I think they got married in the 50s. And he was a major supporter of, I mean, here too, we might be getting kind of questions of gender coming up, that he, to a certain extent, sort of allowed her to be like the art star in the household. He was someone who had a lot of diplomatic connections, and so she's able to kind of rub elbows with the political elites in Haiti when she travels there. And she becomes very interested in Haiti, thinks about the importance of Haiti's connections to a kind of broader African diaspora, and I guess thanks to her husband, right, is able to really kind of embed herself there when she visits. Before she went to Africa with the Howard-sponsored trip, she traveled to Haiti 2 years earlier to undertake a study of Black culture for I think with the main purpose of collecting slides for the Howard Slide Library. So she's given these kind of research fellowships to go to these locations. And Haiti seems to come much more, Haiti is certainly part of we could think about a kind of longer history of African-American art, a longer history of Black radical politics, so going back to Toulouse-Louverture and thinking about the Haitian Revolution. He's a figure who's making his way into images by Jacob Lawrence, maybe most famously, but various other Black artists in the United States depict the Haitian Revolution. And so we could think about Haiti as perhaps having those kinds of resonances as well for Jones when she's thinking about it being part of this kind of archipelago of the Black Atlantic also. All right, so I guess we're just about out of time. So thank you guys so much for the questions. Thanks for being a great audience. Have a good rest of your day.